fine. My name again is Josh Horton. I'm with the Solar Geoengineering Research Program. Today we have Cynthia Scharf with us. Cynthia is a senior fellow at the International Center for Future Generations, which you can tell us a little bit about maybe. For that, you were a senior strategy director at the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, or C2G, a very prominent sort of actor in the solar geoengineering space in terms of raising awareness and building awareness about the topic. Prior to that, a very long career at the UN, which we can talk about as well. I will turn it over to you, Cynthia. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Come on, let's hear the voices. Hello. Wake up, yes. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity that Josh and the organization here has provided. I'm going to start with a confession. I wish I never had my job. That's because I wish this topic didn't exist. Because that would mean that my generation had actually listened over the last 30 years to all the warnings we've had from scientists about climate change and done something much more serious about it. But we haven't, and that's why we have come here today to talk about something that potentially might be one of the tools in the toolbox to respond to climate change. Now, I'm sure you all followed the COP in Baku. It exceeded my already low expectations. That plus the election of Donald Trump has made this conversation, unfortunately, more timely and more relevant. So with that as a backdrop, I also just wanted to add, I was at the Secretary General's office for 8 years. I was the one writing his speeches and media talking points and communication on climate change before, during, and after Paris. And that experience has also, strangely enough, led me to a study of this topic, because I think communications and understanding the other person on the side of the podium, how do we reach people in a way that doesn't lose them? How do we talk about this in a way that is non-hysterical on either side, is a really important piece of this topic. So why are we even talking about solar radiation modification? And if you don't mind, I'm going to use the acronym SRM. And in most cases, unless I specify, what I'm really talking about is SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection. So we're talking about this because climate impacts are obviously worsening and accelerating. We are hurtling towards 3 degrees Celsius, which is twice the Paris goal, by the end of the century. And from 2025 till the end of the century is one person's lifetime. So this is not something far in the future. And the thought of going to 2 or 3 degrees is profoundly frightening. And if you're not frightened, you should be. We are potentially on the verge of tipping points, climate tipping points and social tipping points. I'll talk about the social tipping points a bit later, but there is ample concern, and again, growing concern, that as the planet heats up, we may be transgressing certain planetary boundaries or climate tipping points, after which there would be no reversal of impacts. So again, SRM, but I'm mostly talking about SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection. So what is it and what is it not? It's not a substitute. It is not a solution. And at very best, it's a temporary supplement to emission reductions and CDR and adaptation and climate finance. And this is probably the first message I start with when I speak to senior policymakers, because that's my job, is to meet people at levels where they may not have even heard about this, but they're in decision-making roles. And we'll get into that a bit later, but I wanted to just give you that top-line message. It's not a substitute, it's not a solution, at best it's a supplement. And anyone who tells you differently, that this solves climate change, is not credible. So, what do global policymakers know and think about SRM? So Josh's mention of my work previously, I was with the C2G initiative, a Carnegie climate governance initiative. And we met for over 7 years with global policymakers at senior levels, all of the G20, save maybe 1 or 2, but the US and Russia and China, yes. We met with numbers of NGOs, both international NGOs as well as national level NGOs to the best of our capabilities. And we met with all the senior figures in the UN who are relevant to the climate change discussion. And the arc of that narrative, or that 7-year span of messaging and comprehension, is actually quite interesting. When we started, people didn't want to speak with us. They didn't want to have the meeting. But I think just the titles that we had, we came from the UN, and so we had some credibility. They opened the door and allowed us through. But the reaction they had, I could just see in their eyes, was either going totally over their heads, or this is really Hollywood, isn't it? Isn't this, like 30 years away? Why am I wasting my time talking about this? And as the 7 years advanced, as the weather and particularly the climate has worsened, as it's become clear the Paris Agreement is nowhere close to being fulfilled, that incredulity switched to a sense of anxiety, switched to a sense of anxious, nervous interest in what is this thing that we're talking about. And I should say that what we had conversations both behind closed doors and some publicly, what policymakers said behind closed doors is very different than most policymakers will say publicly. And in fact, most global policymakers won't talk about it at all. So at the COP, there were a few side events put on by some NGOs about SRM, but it was nowhere in the official discussions. And to my mind, that's okay. I still think this issue is too early to be taken up formally in the UNFCCC negotiations. But it still is not an issue with a lot of traction. But as I said, it's growing. Another consideration policymakers have is, what do my constituents think, right? Everyone's thinking about their next election. Will I stay in this office? Will I get promoted? And if they're not hearing from constituents or active media interest or active NGOs, it makes the issue seem far down the line. And so I have 2 very unpleasant messages when I meet with these policymakers. One is, this could be on your watch. It is not something 20 years down the road. And secondly, this is about risks. When we have these discussions, there are very often issues that continue to pop up, regardless if you're speaking with Pakistan or Paraguay or China or whomever. The first one is what we call moral hazard, meaning if we talk about this, we are going to diminish political will to do the things that we know we have to do, which is go to net zero, then go to net negative, ramp up climate finance, strengthen resilience and adaptation. In other words, if we talk about this, people will think it's an easy way out, and that we don't have to do all of those other things. And the reality is, there could be nothing farther from the truth. We still have to do all of those other things, and with urgency. They also are wondering about this term overshoot. Now, Josh, you were involved with the Overshoot Commission. Overshoot means overshooting the temperature goals that are in the Paris Agreement. And they're wondering, well, if we overshoot, how temporary is temporary? And the assumption is it's within a decade. The reality is it's many decades, potentially to the end of the century. And why is that? Because SAI does not solve the problem of accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the only way to wean ourselves off of that technology is to reduce our emissions to 0 and then to net negative, which also implies a massive scale up of CDR. Some other common comments or concerns or misunderstandings. The time frame for decision making for policymakers is not the same time frame that researchers work under. Policymakers at a very senior level may only have a day or two to even think about this issue. And they will be relying upon talking points that their advisees and others have brought to them. Researchers, on the other hand, are very careful. They often work in much longer time spans, and they are very aware of uncertainties. And they take those uncertainties very realistically. They don't come in saying, this is 100% sure that we can do X or Y. But that's what the policymaker really wants to hear, is can I get 100% assurance that this is going to work or not work? And so those two things are in conflict. The other piece I mentioned was about risk. When we at the Carnegie Initiative and in my current job talk about SRM, we talk about it in a risk-risk framing, meaning we must look at the risks as well as the potential benefits, the potential harms, the uncertainties of one scenario and one specific scenario of SAI, because the scenarios differ depending on the deployment that is launched, and the risks of the 2 to 3 degree scenario. So it is not as if you can look at SRM in a vacuum. You must consider those two scenarios. What is the world currently? What is it moving toward very rapidly? And what might it look like if we actually did do some kind of deployment of SAI? And again, there is not just one deployment. There could be a number of variations based on the amount of aerosol released at the latitudes it's deployed, a number of other things. But these two factors, the risks of 3 degrees and the risk of potentially using SRM, are very important to understand as you consider what next steps might need to take place in terms of governance. Then there are some really knotty questions, and I mean K-N-O-T-T-Y, about the ethics of using SRM. On the one hand, people can say, we do not have the right to do this, and that usually falls in the camp of human hubris, that we are not wise enough to use a tool that is potentially transformative, that would affect every country in the world, though not necessarily equally, and would affect future generations. We are simply not wise enough to handle that kind of a potential transformation. There are others who say, what right do we have not to research it and potentially not to use it if the research shows in a convincing way that the potential benefits outweigh the potential harms? So the ethics pivots on a number of different points. That is one of them, the right to do something, hubris. The other is about generational equity, intergenerational justice. We have to think about future generations, not just ourselves or even just our children or grandchildren. But if this technology were to be deployed, it could last a century or more. So how do we think about future generations and address that question in an equitable manner? Another very common ethical dilemma is that of climate justice. Will those countries that have suffered first and worst from climate change be receiving a better outcome or a worse outcome from SRM? What is just? What happens if there are harms? How will liability play out in the international arena? Who will compensate people for those harms? Those discussions are just beginning. I know Josh has done some very good research looking at some of those questions about liability. But all of these questions are the underpinnings of governance. During the 7 years of talking to people, I had some observations of policymakers. And one is, this is not Paris politics as usual. So what do I mean by that? Paris politics, if I can boil it down extremely simply, is rich countries versus poor countries. And finding a way to break through that paradigm was the essence of how the Paris deal came together when the US and China agreed to take some mutually positive steps forward. The SAI-SRM debate is not breaking down into that nice two bifurcated construction, because poor countries, climate vulnerable countries, might just be benefiting the most from SRM. We simply don't know right now. They could also potentially be harmed the most. Again, we just don't know. The research at present seems to suggest it might be beneficial, but there is not 100% certainty, and there are many questions that still need to be addressed about this. So there's interest in SRM on the part of poor countries. And if you think about it, it's logical. If you're a large country with an agricultural population of 40%, working outdoors, and if there are wet bulb temperatures above 40 degrees C, you could see millions of people actually dying from attempting to go outside and do their jobs and feed the country. And so why wouldn't you, as a policymaker, be interested in a technology that could potentially turn down the thermostat and allow parts of your population to work outside? Why wouldn't you be interested in that? Or if you're a small island and you simply have no faith in the UNFCCC process for solving anything that's going to extend the life of your island and its ability to be inhabited, why wouldn't you be interested in this technology? I can share with you an anecdote that actually is real. Took place about 3 or 4 years ago when I was up at the Arctic Circle Assembly. And I was there again this year, but this one took place back in 2019. So on a panel that I was chairing, I brought in 2 Indigenous women from different communities, one from Alaska, the other from the Canadian Yukon. One was 38 years old, the other was 18. And I asked them about how they feel about SRM testing in their communities' areas. The 38-year-old woman basically said, I've already had cancer, thank you very much. You've already been playing as if I'm a rat in your laboratory for many years on other technologies, nuclear testing, radiation, seepage, all of those other things. I don't trust you, so no way in hell are you going to test those technologies in my area. I then turned to the 18-year-old and I said, what do you think about the possibility of testing SRM, or even potentially one day using it? She turned to her 38-year-old colleague and said, I'm really sorry you feel that way, but frankly, I work on teen suicide in my community, so suck it up, quote unquote. So you can see that the ethics question is not simple to answer. Lastly, in terms of thinking about how policymakers might respond, we have to understand that the gap between what research is finding out and what policymakers know is vast. And in fact, many senior policymakers have never heard of SRM, or if they have, it's basically some kind of Hollywood depiction. I cannot emphasize enough how big that gap is, that chasm between researchers and policymakers. And that's quite dangerous, because as climate impacts accelerate, as research accelerates on SRM, that chasm could widen. And we do not want to see a situation in which governance is playing catch-up. That is not effective, and that will not be equitable. So what is the state of play globally? In a sentence, it's the science is the easy part of this. And no offense meant to anyone who's working on the physical sciences of SRM here, but the science is the easy part of this. It's the governance that will prove particularly challenging. Right now, there are no comprehensive governance frameworks for SRM. They're bits and pieces in other UN bodies. So for example, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, in the Montreal Protocol, in the London Convention, the London Protocol. There are bits and pieces that you can see, but there is no one overarching governance framework that would handle the array of issues that SAI would bring up. And then we must be careful to think about research governance and governance of deployment. Now, obviously they're related, but they are not one and the same thing. And governance of research, even though it's very challenging, is, I think, nowhere near as challenging as governance of deployment. So, just a few of those UN entities that I spoke about. I've heard a number of NGOs on one particular side of the spectrum talk about SRM and the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD. And oftentimes they say there is already a de facto moratorium on SRM because it's there in the CBD. That is not accurate. First of all, the US is not a party to the CBD. So there cannot be a de facto moratorium for that simple reason. Secondly, they issued a decision, but it was a non-binding decision. It was guidance to the parties. So there is nothing in international law that is legally enforceable on SRM from the Convention on Biological Diversity. I'm not saying if that's good or bad, I'm simply saying that's the reality. So when people say, oh, there's already a de facto moratorium, that is not true. And on the IPCC, I should just add, in the last AR6, there is some content about SRM governance and research. It is not extensive. In AR7, which will most likely come out in 2028, I think we'll see quite a bit more. There might be some kind of cross-chapter work that is done, or even potentially a chapter. I think it's unknown at this stage how extensive it might be, but having the IPCC look at this issue is certainly in everyone's interest. So, again, when meeting with policymakers, how did we introduce ourselves? First of all, we were not aiming to speak with the climate minister or the environment minister. Our ideal interlocutor was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Why? For very practical reasons. SAI is an everything issue. It's not just about climate. It's about security, and I'll talk a bit later about that. It's about your agricultural production, your economy's durability and resilience. It's about your population's health. It's about a lot of things. It is not just about a scientific analysis of climate. And to be very crass about it, most climate and environment ministries around the world don't have much power. They don't have much money, and they don't have much capacity. And sometimes you'll see in a country that the person that is attending and negotiating at the CBD, and then at the Montreal Protocol, and then at the UNFCCC is the same person. So they literally do not have the capacity or the bandwidth to keep all of the detailed issues in one person's portfolio. And so when you go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it's usually more capacitated, they have more money, and frankly, they have a lot more clout. And so that's where we were aiming to have our conversations. So what would happen, just take a hypothetical example, if there were a large-scale outdoor test that took place next month? Or even a deployment, a sub-global deployment. It is unrealistic to think that we are going to have a global scale deployment this year or anything in the next handful of years. But if there was a large-scale outdoor test, what might the response be? Well, I just said there is no UN body that already covers all the array of issues that SRM, SAI brings up. So it might just land in the Secretary General's lap. I've seen that happen with other issues as well. And what he might look to is bringing in his climate principles from UNEP, WMO, UNFCCC, et cetera, and trying to coordinate some kind of response. This is a version of muddling through, which doesn't sound very reassuring, does it? Muddling through is not good enough. On the other hand, we simply don't see an interest at the international level, particularly in some countries, particularly in this country as of January 20th, for multilateral governance or for the creation of yet a new multilateral institution. I just don't see the political will for that. Maybe someone can prove me wrong. I'm happy to be wrong, but I don't see evidence of that. So right now, we're left with the muddling through option. Some call it poly-governance. I think that's basically the same idea, but different organizations would parcel out different pieces of the puzzle. Some might look at monitoring, some might look at satellite verification, others might look at different pieces about how it fits into the international climate policy regime. But again, there is no one overarching body. And this is a very simple graphic just to show this is not just about one implication. Political implications spread into other realms: national security, climate risks, human rights, future equity, intergenerational justice. So again, that is why speaking to someone with a capacity to look at this issue from multiple perspectives is needed. So SAI governance. I'm talking now about governance of deployment. There is a very simple phrase that people use, I've used it myself many times, when talking about this issue to the public, which is, whose finger is on the global thermostat? How do we decide that? Should the 10 or 12 states that are probably able to deploy this technology be the ones to decide? What about the climate vulnerable communities? Again, those who have been affected first and worst, and who might be affected for better or for worse with the use of SAI? How do they come into that governance conversation? And then young people and future generations. How do we incorporate their concerns in this conversation? And I feel particularly strongly about young people today. I have a daughter who's in her late 20s. I have had some interactions with youth-led groups when I was at the UN. And I think it's extremely important for young people who are interested in the climate issue, which is probably a majority of people at this point, to look at what is SRM. Is this something that we might be interested in potentially having as a tool? Is it too scary? Is it ungovernable? But to get into that debate now. Because if you're not in the debate now, you're going to be on the margins. And your input is not going to matter at nearly a significant extent. So I really encourage young people, your peers, to look into this issue. I'm not telling you what to think, obviously, but learning is so very important. The geopolitics of SAI. Are we looking at science or politics or both? So when I speak with the researchers I know, it is quite clear that they have not had many interactions with policymakers, and that they're looking at things that the research tells them is extremely important to look at. But if you ask a policymaker, what are the 10 questions you have about SRM? You'll get very different questions. So oftentimes it's, who can do it? How much does it cost? Who's doing it right now? Who might be cheating? How do we know? And questions along those lines. Very simple questions that says that decisions on SRM deployment are not going to be made on science alone. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I am not going to weigh in on that. I leave it to you to think about that. But I can tell you that science is only one part of that equation. And there's a quote that I ran across recently by Victor Hugo, of all people. He said, "Science says the first word on everything and the last word on nothing." And that quote might be relevant for this discussion. SAI is a geopolitical issue, in one part because it is also a tool of diplomacy, or will be in the future. It will be a tool of international geopolitical prestige. It will be a tool of leverage for those countries who are able to deploy it. So again, science is essential. It is not the entire picture, and it may actually be a minor part of a decision on whether to deploy. Climate tipping points are sometimes talked about in the context of a deployment, for example, in an area of a global climate tipping point. But in my mind, actually, a social tipping point might be just as relevant to any decision. And by that, I mean an example. Think about the country that, again, has a very large agricultural population, which of course has to work outside. That wet bulb temperature target is approaching the lethal point. It's a democracy. So people clamor to their government, do something. We don't care about future generations. We don't care what the UN thinks. We are dying. Do something. I call that a social tipping point. And that's where an issue like SRM could very easily pop up. And you could see a reversal in public attitudes toward SAI occur very quickly. Another set of reasons why the attraction of SAI might be tempting, I call it a seductive technology because it is very fast acting compared to any other tool we have in the climate policy toolkit. It is relatively inexpensive compared to decarbonizing the global climate, which would cost trillions of dollars. And its impacts might be readily seen. So think of a populist or a nationalist leader. I won't say names. How tempting might it be to have some tool that doesn't cost much, that doesn't have any governance to restrain you, that shows impacts quickly? How tempting might it be to use that tool? Those are some of the dynamics that go into thinking about this as a geopolitical instrument. Security. Security is one of the top issues on the minds of most global policymakers, especially now. It is in the European Union, and that was even before Donald Trump was reelected. It will be an increasingly important part of this conversation. I personally believe that SAI is not a weapon. It is too easily detected and monitored. If you're having fleets of 100 or more jets flying around on a 24/7 basis at different latitudes of the world, that's detectable. That is not a stealth operation. And of course, the person launching it is hoping that it benefits them and can't really tell what the effects might be on other countries at particular times. So it is also way too broad of a target. That said, SAI could be a potential trigger for conflict. In the most well-intentioned circumstances, country A might be suffering from one of those either social or climate impact points. It decides to launch a large test or even some kind of subglobal or even global deployment. Now remember, again, there's only 10 or 12 countries that have that capability going forward and maybe in the next 10 or 15 years. So country A launches for benign, well-intentioned reasons. Unintentionally, there is a drought in a neighboring region. I can easily imagine the average person in the street saying, hey, you country A caused the drought in my country. That's an act of war. And with social media and the rapidity of information and the internet and all those things, we can easily see how that interpretation would spin out of control. And then, of course, there's misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Some of you may have heard something about a conspiracy theory called contrails and the chemtrailers. It is real. There are many people out there who believed that the white cloud, the white lines you see when jets fly in the air, in the atmosphere, is the government brainwashing us with different chemicals. I know it sounds absurd. There are lots of people who believe that. In 2017, on the very opening day of the Carnegie Initiative in Manhattan, there were people outside the doors with protest posters from the chemtrailers. So this is not just a small bit of crackpots. It is something that has resonance with people, smart people. And as climate impacts worsen and we become more and more desperate, I think it's a given that we are going to see an increasing number of conspiracy theories and mis- or disinformation campaigns. So let's look at one particular example. So I mentioned I was just in the Arctic. I was in Reykjavik for the third time at the Arctic Circle Assembly, which has 2,500 people attending. Governments, including governments that are not, have contiguous borders with the Arctic. So China's there, India's there, parts of the EU is there, Brazil is there, it's global. You have researchers and you have business people. So it's a very strange mix. All of them in the back of their minds are aware that the Arctic is melting. And it is melting at 4 times the rate of anywhere else on the globe. And that there are potential climate tipping points that we need to take very careful consideration of in the next decade or next few decades. You might have heard of something called AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional, the Atlantic Ocean Meridional, wait, why am I getting it wrong? Atlantic Meridional Ocean Current, excuse me. AMOC, or the Greenland ice sheets, or sea ice melt. Scary prospects, and not tens of thousands of years down the road, but perhaps this century, or even in a few decades. So there's a lot of talk in this assembly about what potentially might we do given this backdrop. And one of the most looked to potential tools in the climate policy toolkit to address this concern is SAI. And there have been some papers put out in the last year or two by some folks who've studied here or who are fellows at Harvard, talking about how long might it be before the world could actually realize a global deployment of SAI or even a subglobal deployment of SAI or SAI launched in the subpolar regions. And that's anywhere between 5 and 15 years. And that is nothing in terms of a policymaker's lifeline, his electoral cycle, and how long it takes to create international governance. That's a wink of an eye. And the agreement we reached in Paris in 2015 basically took about 30 years to get to, on an issue and a way of looking at climate change that one might say is even easier to deal with than the governance of SAI. But what is very apparent is that there are very few senior policymakers working in the Arctic region or making policy with relevant impacts in the Arctic who know about this technology. And I can say that from first-hand experience, meeting with some Arctic envoys who had never heard of SAI. So again, that chasm between the research community and the policymaking community is very real, and it especially is real in the Arctic. I mentioned there were countries coming from places who do not have contiguous borders. If SAI were to be used, and if there were to be a climate tipping point in the Arctic, it could potentially affect every country. Now, the governance structure in the Arctic was set up years ago. It's called the Arctic Council. It has 8 member countries, including Russia and the US, and other countries, again, that have borders in the Arctic. And it basically doesn't look at controversial issues. It looks at how can we provide sustainable development for the indigenous communities there. It looks at different parts of Arctic research. But it usually does not take on controversial issues because you have the US and Russia in one body. The Arctic Council had a rude awakening on February 24th of 2022 because that's the date of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think within a fortnight, Russia was basically outcast from the Arctic Council. Now, of course, they're still members, but no meetings were taking place with Russia in that small circle. And that impasse where the 7 other members are not talking with Russia continues to this day. How long might that last? How long is the war in Ukraine going to last? We don't know. But that's a very scary situation, that the multilateral governance body, that is the governance body for the Arctic, is really not functioning with a country that has 45% of the global total of the Arctic region in its borders. Researchers are also quite nervous that they're not receiving science and much needed data on methane emissions, on all kinds of other pieces of this puzzle, if the Russian scientific community is excluded from conversations. And that's really a serious concern, because in this decade and the next few decades to come, some decisions that might be made will have reverberations for longer than the entire course of human civilization thus far. That is an awesome responsibility to have. And so not having this vital data from the Arctic region, from Russian researchers, is really not the situation we want to be in. And yet, that's where we are. I mentioned there were different parts of the the Arctic Council that look at science. The most prominent is AMAP, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. I actually spoke to AMAP back in 2018 to their chairman, who did not even know what SRM was. So we had some interactions briefing him up on that. I spoke to the AMAP chair a few years later. He definitely knew what it was. He was from NOAA originally, so he had a very good understanding of SRM and SAI, but thought it was much too controversial of an issue to bring up. If you recall, I just said that the Arctic Council very rarely picks up controversial issues. So he didn't want to bring it into that arena. But now AMAP is actually thinking about should they do some research, some assessment of SAI, SRM in the Arctic. So when I was in Reykjavik a month ago, I spoke to the chair of AMAP and to the executive secretary of the AMAP secretariat. They are now aware of SRM and SAI. We've been feeding them information and names of researchers and where do things stand in the conversation, trying to encourage a sense of urgency on this issue. I got an email from them a couple of weeks ago saying, yes, we're bringing it up for the very first time, and a decision is pending. And not pending 5 years from now, but maybe in a half year. And to my mind, that's progress. That the body that is responsible for research in the Arctic under the Arctic Council is finally going to look at this issue. But that just tells you how separated the policy and the research conversations are. So let's look at some of the geopolitical undercurrents of what SAI might entail. The US and China. They both agree that climate change is a serious and imminent threat. So does the EU, so does India, so does Brazil, so do many countries in the G20. Does Russia? Under Vladimir Putin, to my knowledge, not really. Years ago, I used to work in the Soviet Union / Russia. So I was looking into Russian knowledge about this issue. And as far as I was told by researchers in the Russian scientific community, there were no policy discussions about this. I think they are taking place, but they're probably taking place at a classified level. But publicly, we do not have a massive country that is one of the P5 on the UN Security Council actively taking any measures on climate action to reduce emissions and pay attention to the potential devastating consequences in the permafrost areas across the Russian plains. And we have a member of the P5 that is not willing to look at this issue as a security issue. Who's got power in the world right now? We basically have two superpowers, the US and China. The Paris Agreement was possible because the US and China, many years before Paris, had very senior people on our side, John Kerry, on their side, Xi Jinping, meet and build trust between them over a period of years. It was a personal bonding. The Chinese lead was invited to go to basketball games, and John Kerry was invited to come to the home of his Chinese counterpart. There was years of trust building that it took to have both of those countries say, hey, we are both really concerned about climate change, and we're going to cordon off this area of our overall relationship so that jointly we can make some progress on climate change. So what US and China think about SAI is critically important for its governance and for the geopolitical mapping of this issue. I believe that whether the US and China have cooperation or competition, either one will greatly shape the governance of this technology. But that said, as powerful as those two countries are for a number of reasons, and again, I read a paper recently that Josh contributed to talking about why from a number of different angles, it is necessary to have the US and China on board when discussing some kind of global governance, but it is not sufficient from an equity, from a climate perspective. We need the voices and views of all countries, because all countries would be affected for better or for worse. We need especially the voices of those climate vulnerable countries. We have to think about future generations. How do we combine all of those pieces so that we're looking at a potential agreement that is equitable? How does that play out? And what might the US and or China do to help bring some of these countries into that conversation? We need to look at the long game. What is the potential path forward? Again, as I said at the beginning, we have to uphold the Paris Agreement and affirm that it is really the cornerstone right now in international governance of the climate issue. We have to make sure that emissions reductions, CDR, adaptation, et cetera, are all on track, all of which are not at the moment. But could we be looking at a potential agreement anchored by the US and China, where there was an agreement on joint research, transparent, publicly publishable research on SRM between the US and China and other countries, and twinned with that an agreement on non-use? Now, a lot of moratoria get hung up on the first step of the process, which is criteria for ending the moratorium. So it's still a bit wishy-washy to say when we have enough scientific information to make a reasonable conclusion, that is when we would lift a moratorium. That is certainly true. I have no objections to that statement, but you can see there's a lot of room for maneuver in that context and in that formulation. Potentially a moratorium or a non-use agreement could be tied to a time-bound event that is already in the global climate architecture. One of those might be the UNFCCC global stocktake. Happens every 5 years, happening next year in Brazil. It's a 5-year increment where all the parties to the UNFCCC, which is basically everyone, comes together and, like a poker game, throws in their chip and says, I might be willing to ante up my ante here. Maybe that could be a time-bound marker for some kind of agreement not to use SAI or some large-scale deployment of SRM during the period where the US and China and other countries are jointly working on research. This is just an idea. It has not been road tested anywhere in my organization or ones I used to work for. I certainly don't think it's been road tested at the UN. But I just wanted to throw it out there as a way for us to start thinking creatively and bringing the two pieces of the governance conversation together. What is equitable and what are the realpolitik considerations? So a governance structure is both effective, the realpolitik, and equitable. As I said, the Paris Agreement came to being because the US and China cordoned off that issue and agreed to work on it, despite all the other issues between those two countries. Could SRM be cordoned off from other issues under a new regime that we see in the US? Don't know. Trust building is absolutely vital to this discussion. Could there be something like track 2 diplomacy? Something like the pugwash model? Could there be scientific collaboration that goes on and that helps build bonds between not only the US and China, but the US and Russia? Russian researchers, that vital Arctic research that is not happening right now due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Could those be possible steps forward? Lastly, I just want to give a few thoughts on what Trump 2 might mean for this topic. One thing was pretty clear from Baku. I wasn't there, but many of my colleagues were. The US has basically ceded global leadership of climate change to China. What if, as in the first administration of Trump, that there was no awareness of SAI in the higher echelons of the of the executive branch? What if they just didn't see it? Research could continue. You would see probably privately funded research, which has some real issues with it. There would be little public oversight. It could potentially go the other way. As climate impacts accelerate, you could see some folks potentially coming to the White House saying, hey, did you know there's this tool called SAI? There's no pesky UN or international governance of it to hinder us in what we want to do. The US leads the world in global research on this issue. Why don't we give it a go? Or at least, why don't we think about it? Potentially, you'll see an acceleration of US-funded research. You might see bombastic claims about what it might be able to do. Maybe there's a potential test outdoors that's planned. One thing for sure is you'd see an international outcry from other countries, but that is also a potential scenario. And as we think about the future of this technology, we must keep reminding ourselves that the consequences could last for millennia, just as what we do or don't do on climate change could last for a millennia or more. And so with that, I'll bring it to a close. I wanted to give a shout out again to Josh. We've had some conversations about this US-China piece, what that might look like, how to move forward, so I thank you. And I'm so glad to see a lot of people in the room that are interested in this topic because we need more of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments, so I'll open the floor to hands raised. Start there.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I think you laid out the governance challenges with SCI. I had a question about private sector involvement. So, as we speak, there are startups in California running around doing solar geoengineering with limited oversight, and they're collecting donation funding to release particles into the air. So, in an ideal world, how should this be regulated? I mean, should this be banned, or how would you think about this?
For the private sector.
Yeah. There's no regulations on any of this.
So right now I know of 2 private sector actors who are working on this issue, SAI specifically. One of them is really more of a provocation than anything else. You may have heard of a group called Make Sunsets. The other much more serious private entity is called Stardust. It is now registered as a US company in Delaware, but it is run by and created by some Israeli scientists, very top-notch scientists, so not a fly-by-night kind of operation. They've received several $1 million in VC funding thus far. I think they're trying to raise much more as well. And they're looking at a new type of aerosol. So most studies to date have been looking at sulfate aerosols. They're looking at some other material that would be sprayed in the stratosphere. And I think they are looking for IP on what that might be. They're also looking at what kind of dispersal mechanism might be needed. So there are private sector actors getting into this conversation. And right now, as I said, there's no overarching governance on an international level that might look at this, but you might well see national legislation or even subnational. So I think it was last summer that Tennessee, the state of Tennessee, came up with some regulation about geoengineering that was, I think, fueled by some of the chemtrailer folks, and it just kind of spun out of control what this might be. So at the subnational level, you might see some regulation that comes on the private sector, but it is coming. And both of those events were within the last 2 years. Yes, and then after that, yes.
So thank you for your comments. So as you know, the UK government is in the process of launching a research program that will be inclusive of outdoor experiments on solar geoengineering. And they've also just announced a fairly ambitious NDC for reducing emissions in the next iteration of the Paris Agreement process. And that sets them up in a kind of good space, right? A commitment to mitigation and adaptation and now exploring solar geoengineering. I'm wondering, rather than thinking about the unlikely prospects of a US-China collaboration on solar geoengineering research in the foreseeably near future, whether one might imagine and maybe try to encourage the UK collaborating with another, perhaps a global south nation, maybe Brazil, right? So just thinking about a collab that doesn't require the kind of the world's superpowers to engage, but really have this be jump-started in a way that is perhaps more grounded in nations that have the right sets of characteristics and interest to be engaging.
Yep. Good question. Remember, I did say the long game. The long game with US and China is really what I was speaking about. Yes, the middle powers, as they're called. You might imagine some Nordic countries, potentially the EU, the UK. That could go forward, and that would be a good thing, I think. Again, a kind of a twinned agreement on let's do more research, publicly funded, so it's transparent and accountable, twinned with we promise not to deploy. That could be an avenue. I was looking at it in, I must admit, the more realpolitik frame of which are the 2 countries that eventually are going to be shaping whatever governance happens on SAI. So that does not obviate what you said. In fact, it might be a seeding ground. It could be a test run of how does this actually work? What do we learn from that could be applied to the superpowers? So that's an interesting piece of research, certainly, that maybe someone should dive into.
Hi, Michelle. Good afternoon, and thank you for the presentation. I have 2 very quick questions. One was just to get a sense on your sense if you're being a little overly ambitious or overly optimistic. And the reason I ask that is for 2 things. One, we really don't have any natural analog here. We've been mentioning a lot about, I think, the Mount Pinatubo eruption that's happening, but the scale at which we want to decrease the impact of heating, that level of scale we don't find in a paleoclimatic analog. That where the scale at which we would want and use of governance required in the future. Are we, in that sense, being overly optimistic since we don't have analogs on both these fronts? And secondly, also currently is there a preference within discussions within the United States on any platform which could, in perhaps the interim, hold governance on solar geoengineering? Is it the Montreal Protocol, considering the deployment site is the ozone, or yeah, is there any discussion around that?
So that was a lot you packed in one question here. Let me see if I can unpack some of it. When you said I'm overly optimistic or overly ambitious, meaning on the governance side or on the fact that this is not as far down the road on research? I think the world's leading experts sitting in the back row could inform us about the timeline for research moving forward. On the governance side, frankly, I didn't think I was optimistic. I was trying to be realistic, talking about how long it took to even get the Paris Agreement, talking about the level of distrust that there is in the global geopolitical situation, the non-appetite for a multilateral new institution to go forward. So I think I'm actually pretty pessimistic about the prospect of those. But I also think my pessimism stems from the thought that someone might try a large-scale test in the next decade because the desperation increases. Go ahead, Britt.
Thanks. I'm wondering if you could just say more about this sort of like cordoning off SRM approach. You sort of mentioned at the end that maybe it would be effective to kind of keep it in the climate space in the same way as Paris cordoned off climate and other geopolitical conflicts. But then earlier, I feel like there was this mention of, oh, like SAI is this global issue with impacts for security and health, and it's really being talked about as just a climate issue when conceivably it is so much broader than that,
Right.
with agricultural impacts, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So I feel like there's a tension between those two, and I don't know how to think about it, so I'm curious.
Yep.
Where you go.
Yeah, it's a very good question. The same was true on just climate change, right? The climate change affects everything. Security, productivity, well-being, you go down the road. So when we look at the security issue about SAI, we compare it to the security consequences of climate change and the security consequences of a use of SAI. It can't be looked at in the abstract. But to get to your question, basically that cordoning off in the Paris Agreement was about cordoning it off even though climate change affects every single thing as well. And so will SAI. So I do think if there was a political will to compartmentalize it, that could be done, because climate change is an everything issue as well. SAI is an everything issue. So if we could do it for Paris, I hope I'm not being too wildly optimistic, in the long game, could we do that on SAI? Yep.
So, you talked about the researchers and policymakers, and I guess general population came up, in terms of like dramatic event that might push people to press on their policymakers, right? But since it's sort of focusing on those two, I was wondering how much or that there's research on sort of the worldview aspect, right? I'm from the divinity school, so obviously that's sort of my bent. But you mentioned the Tennessee bill, and at least as I understand it, right, that sort of comes out of the sort of chemtrail, anti-vax, like sort of this anti-manipulation of nature sort of thing, which is a pretty natural sort of progression. It fits within that worldview pretty succinctly. And so I guess, I guess just what type of consideration on the part of researchers goes towards worldview and like how people are likely outside of maybe including those dramatic events. But you kind of what I'm saying?
I think so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the questions you're asking have more to do with the social sciences, I think. And social science research is currently being done on these technologies. We need a lot more of it. So the physical and social sciences need to ramp up. The social science side is definitely not leading that conversation right now, But there have been some polls done with countries in the global south and the global north asking about attitudes toward SRM. And the little amount of research that has come out thus far seems to indicate that countries in the global south are more interested in this technology than countries in the global north. And that makes sense for the reasons I discussed. If you already see the impacts of climate change devastating your country, of course you're going to be interested in something that might buy time, give you 10 more years or whatever it is. That doesn't mean they want to see it, but there is interest in it. There's a lot more room for global input, for taking this issue to other sectors of society. Public engagement is often talked about as something that's a critical need on this issue. So absolutely, and not just public engagement in the US, but globally. And one thing I didn't touch on, but I still feel is a really important part of the global engagement, is talking to faith communities. When something like 8 out of 10 people on this planet profess a belief in God or gods, if we don't find a way to talk to those folks, then we're shutting ourselves out of a conversation that could be driven by values. And that's an important piece of this. What are the values that come into play when people think about, do we have the right to do this, or do we have any right to not do this? So it's a values conversation. And faith communities are an important part of that. And in fact, in our first year of operation with the Carnegie Initiative, we did a half-day briefing at the Vatican. So just to throw that in the mix as well.
Actually, I want to follow up on that.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've done a lot of work on sort of faith-based communities, religions, and how people look at SRM. Can you say any more about sort of your general impressions of what, it's not a single global faith community,
Mm-hmm.
different traditions, or maybe collectively, that how people of faith view, SRM, prospect,
Mm-hmm.
different kinds of views that you've encountered?
Yeah, this research is really at the infancy. So I used to be on the board of something called Green Faith, which was a multi-faith climate initiative. They published a short report where they went and talked to 12 leading either scholars or practitioners of different faiths from both Eastern and Western traditions. And the level of really understanding what SAI might involve was not really there, but they referred to their own faith traditions about stewardship of the planet, taking care of next generations. But I have to say, the initial reaction when we started putting this publication together was, oh, you got to be kidding. Wow, we're playing God? And in fact, that was the title of the publication, Playing God. So the first framing that comes into the minds of people is playing God, that's not a good thing, here's why. But encouraging communities in the global south and faith communities in the global south to talk about this, we might see some very interesting other kinds of responses. It needs research. If anyone's looking for a research project, that's one area that is really climbing out for some research. Yep.
Yeah, hi. I direct a research program here at Harvard that collaborates with China on climate-related issues, and we worked on a lot of different topics, but not this topic.
Mm-hmm.
But it comes up sometimes in our conversations. We work with a lot of different universities. We interact with the government. Xinhua, we talked to about actually this problem. One meeting we had, he was very negative about it, but that was a long time ago. I can understand your argument, the governance argument you're making for research collaboration between U.S. and China in this area. I'd kind of like to hear more about the research case for that kind of collaboration. My understanding, and as I said, we don't work in this area, but we kind of track it a little bit and pay attention, is that the research capacities in China on SRM are minimal. And it would be a very asymmetrical research relationship if there was such a relationship. And I wonder if that complicates the proposition that you're making, in the sense that it maybe politicizes it a little bit, it maybe could factor into some security concerns of the U.S. giving away a lot of knowledge that China doesn't yet have. And I'm talking about in our current political times. I know you said long term, but in the immediate 4-year
Great question. I was thinking of it most prominently from a geopolitical governance perspective and not the research, but you're right. China has maybe a small handful, 24 or more people at Tsinghua University and elsewhere, Beijing Normal, working on this. As far as we know, on the unclassified level. I can't tell you on the classified level. I simply do not know. What about something where you have a joint agreement to educate young scholars together on this issue? That's just another way to get at it if you don't want to bring in this asymmetry between the US being so far ahead of China on this issue. Maybe it's some kind of Fulbright-like partnership between young researchers in the US and young researchers in China. Again, just getting the trust relationship at its core. Start to build those relationships. I see the points you made. I think they're all valid. Again, I was looking at the real long game, but I think that's an interesting thought. And then not only just US and China, but bringing in the Degrees Initiative, which is an NGO that is working to bring in researchers from the Global South on SRM. Bringing those together. Maybe it's something that the EU also champions. But I really do want to believe that you're going to need folks who can drive an agreement politically, and you need the people who are being affected the most for equity. You need to bring those two things together. And how do we do that? So that's my challenge to all of us to think about.
On that note, you must be starving, Cynthia. So
Not yet, but
let's call it a day. Thank you very much, Cynthia. Wonderful.
Welcome.
Thanks for sharing your